tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello and welcome to the Power of Zero show. This is your host, David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LIRP, The Volatility Shield, and Tax-Free Income for Life, all of which can be purchased, by the way, in bulk at davidmcknightbooks.com. You can mix and match titles and achieve bulk discounts, or in single copies wherever you buy fine books. If you're looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, head on over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, trained, vetted, qualified personally by me, among the very best tax-free planning specialists in the nation. If you're an advisor looking to level up your game, head over to powerofzero.com. Opt into our free 3-part video series. Always looking for a follow on Twitter. It's at McKnight & Co, at McKnight & Co, or on Instagram, David C. McKnight. Okay, we've got a good show for you today. We're going to continue talking about LIRPs and a few of the concepts I discuss in Look Before You LIRP, in which I make the case that starting an LIRP is a bit like getting married. You need to have a laundry list of things you're looking for in a spouse. And you also need to have a laundry list of things you're looking for in an LIRP, because LIRPs, like marriage, only really work if they're till death do you part. Okay, so last week we talked about the importance of having a guaranteed 0% loan provision in your LIRP. Why? Because if insurance companies can change the cost of the loan at their leisure at any point over the course of the next 30 to 50 years, then their fox is in your chicken coop. Remember, if they start you out at a 0% loan, but reserve the right to change that loan to a 1, 2, 5, or 8% whenever they want, then that's not really an LIRP worth hitching your wagon to, if you know what I mean. Because if the most important provision in the entire contract isn't guaranteed, then the insurance company is simply taking a wait-and-see approach with your money, not the type of LIRP you want to have a long-term relationship with. Now, even if the insurance company has a guaranteed 0% loan provision, there's still another way that they can get you. There's 2 ways in which they can configure these loans. They can either charge you interest in advance, or they can charge you interest in arrears. So let's start with the less desirable of the 2, which is interest in advance. With interest in advance, the insurance company charges you the interest rate at the beginning of the year in which you request the loan. So for example, let's say they're charging you 3% on a $100,000 loan. So you would owe them that 3% at the beginning of the year. They would subtract that 3% the day after you request that loan. They would subtract it from your cash value. And because you have to give it to them at the beginning of the year as opposed to the end of the year, you lose out on what that loan interest could have earned for you had you been able to keep it inside your growth account and compound it over the course of that year. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal after a single year, but if you do that each and every year that you take a loan and you then amortize that inefficiency out over the life of the contract, then that can actually be a pretty big drag on your cash value over time. That could end up costing you a couple $100,000 over the life of the program. Now, here's the surprising thing. You may, in fact, have a guaranteed 0% loan with your LIRP, but if your company charges you interest in advance, then that's the equivalent of adding 0.4% to your loan provision. So what appeared to be a guaranteed 0% loan provision at the outset turns into an effective 0.4% loan provision. And that's bad news for all of the reasons we discussed in last week's podcast. All right, now let's talk about interest and arrears. This is really easy. With interest and arrears, they charge you interest at the end of the year. So you're not going to experience the same issues of opportunity costs. So if they're charging you 3% interest at the end of the year and they're crediting you 3% over the course of that year, then you're going to have on hand the interest that they, whatever they credited to your loan collateral account, you're going to have that on hand that pays for the cost of that loan. And so it ends up being a zero cost loan. And that happens at the end of the year. So those 2 numbers, what you owe and what they've credited to you, end up being the exact same amount. So interest in arrears is clearly superior to interest in advance. A loan provision that's guaranteed 0% with interest in arrears is a true, mathematically speaking, true guaranteed 0% loan. Now, just as a caveat, there is one LIRP company out there that I quite like, And by the way, I have a footnote in the updated and revised version of Look Before You LIRP that covers this. So there's a company out there that does charge interest in advance, but this is how they get around it. What they do is they credit your loan collateral account at an interest rate that's greater than what they charge you in advance. So, for example, let's say that they're charging you 3% in advance. They subtract that from your cash value. But what they credit you in your loan collateral account is, say, 4%, then that can more than compensate for the opportunity costs you lost out on over the course of that year. So it's almost as if they were paying you to take the loan. In fact, with this particular company I'm thinking of, it actually does have that net effect. So they charge you interest in advance. They credit you back in interest that's greater than what they charge you in advance. So it's actually like when you do all the math, it's like they're paying you to take the loan, which is obviously an optimal scenario. So that's rare. There's only one company that I know of that does it that way, but that's one instance where it's okay to pay interest in advance. Now, if you have an LIRP and you want to know whether your company has interest in advance or interest in arrears, and what implications that might have, what drag that might create on your LIRP over time, head over to davemcknight.com. Happy to hook you up with a member of our Elite POZO advisor group for a no obligation strategy session, and they'll be happy to take a look at your policy. Okay, so that's the first thing that should be on your laundry list. Well, last week, technically, the loan provision, we talked about that, is on your laundry list. But the second thing we've talked about is that you want to have interest in arrears over interest in advance. Okay, now we're going to talk about the frequency of your LIRP's sweeps. Okay, now this may seem like foreign language to you. What's a sweep and what does it have to do with your LIRP? I will now elucidate this for you. And by the way, if you want to get more sort of elucidation on this concept, you can check out my book, Look Before You LIRP. I got a whole section on it. But basically what happens is when you contribute money to an LIRP, known as Index Universal Life, which is the policy that I prefer and what I recommend and Look Before You LIRP, the insurance company doesn't treat that premium like a normal investment might get treated. With a normal investment, you contribute your money, and within 24 hours typically, it gets contributed to your actual investment account, okay, and starts going to work for you immediately. LIRPs work differently. When you submit your premium to the insurance company, it gets deposited immediately into an account where it earns a nominal interest rate. So it doesn't go immediately into your growth account. It goes into a waiting account where it earns a nominal interest rate. So that money won't actually go to work for you until the insurance company sweeps it out of that nominal interest rate account into the growth account, which of course begs the question, why can't they just sweep it out of there right away? Why can't they do it the very same day? Well, in order to give you the upside of a market index up to a cap, and then guarantee that you'll never lose money, these companies have to use a strategy that involves options. And these options aren't free. They come at a price and they're not cheap, particularly if you're buying options on just a few assets at a time. So as a rule, the larger the pool of money you're buying an option for, the cheaper those options become. It's simply a question of sort of economies of scale. So it's like going to Costco and buying in bulk. The more you get, the cheaper it becomes. So you wouldn't want to buy a can of Campbell's tomato soup at 7-Eleven. You'd want to go to Costco and buy 100 cans of tomato soup, and the cost per ounce is just going to drop through the floor, right? So a lot of smaller companies or a lot of companies that don't have a lot of experience with options, or they just don't do a lot of volume of options, you can't just sweep your money into these option accounts right away, because the cost of options on this smaller pools of assets would be far too expensive. They actually have to pool these assets, let them accumulate over a period of time until they get to a certain threshold. And when they get to that certain threshold, they can then sweep those assets into that growth account all at once. But of course, that comes at a cost. There's a problem. Some companies are so small that they have to wait anywhere from 3 to 6 months to pool up enough money to where it's cost effective enough to purchase the options required to make those assets grow. So there's a problem with that approach. It comes down to what we call opportunity cost. What's opportunity cost? Well, if I give you $1 that I didn't really need to give you, not only do I lose that $1, but I lose what that $1 could have earned for me had I been able to keep it and invest it over the balance of my life. So if every time you make a contribution to your LIRP, if every time you pay that premium, your premium sits around languishing at a nominal interest rate for 3 to 6 months before getting swept into the growth account, then there's an opportunity cost associated with that. You're missing out on the growth on that money for 3 to 6 months. And if you amortize that inefficiency out over the life of your LIRP, which in some cases could be 50 years or more, then that can have a huge drag on your cash value accumulation. Now, there are some companies out there that have daily or weekly sweeps. Now, daily is optimal, as I'll explain here in a second, but weekly sweeps are also acceptable. That means that the minute you make your contribution, at least in a daily sweep, and the minute you make your contribution, that money goes right to work for you that day. So no opportunity cost, no having your money languishing in an account earning almost nothing, and no drag on your cash value over time. Now, one last note on why daily sweeps are the best and why I prefer them and why I insist on having them in my IULs, my LIRPs. When your money is swept out of your account the same day your check hits the insurance company, the clock on your annual point-to-point index period begins. Why is this important? Well, when the insurance company sends out your account statement after a year, then that full annual point-to-point index credit will be reflected on that statement, which means that you're going to be able to not only see the expenses of that policy, but you're going to see what your policy actually grew over the course of that year. Now, if your money gets swept every week or every 3 months or what have you, not only do you have all that opportunity cost associated with it, but you're getting an account statement at the end of the year where it shows all the expenses coming out and you don't have any way of seeing what the growth was on your account. Well, what good is an annual statement if you can't see the growth that you experienced over the course of the prior year? Because you need to wait a full year to allow that annual point-to-point segment to complete, and that clock starts on the day they sweep your money out of that holding account and into the option-based account. So if you give them your check on, say, January 1st, and it doesn't get swept into the growth account until March 1st, that's a lag of 2 months. So you can get your annual account statement January 1st the following year, which you're required to get by law, but you won't even know what your annual point-to-point segment grew until March 1st. Well, that can be frustrating when you see all the expenses coming out of your policy, but you don't see what the growth is. Maybe not a big deal for some people, but for me, it can be galling to have to deal with that. So we've talked about today the importance of having interest in arrears versus interest in advance. There is one instance where interest in advance is okay, but for the most part, we're looking for interest in arrears. And we've also talked about the importance of having your money swept out of that account once it hits the insurance company on a daily basis. That's optimal. I'm okay, with weekly. That's acceptable. Really best case scenario, daily. So if you can get a company that has interest in arrears, guaranteed 0% loan, and sweeps your money out of that account a daily or weekly basis, then you've really aligned the stars and you have an LIRP that you can sort of write off into the sunset with. Once again, if you want to figure out if your LIRP has all of these basic provisions that I think are critical, if you're going to be married to your LIRP for the next 30 to 50 years, head on over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to hook you up with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, trained, vetted, qualified personally by me. They'd be happy to take a look at your policy and examine all of these provisions and make sure that you have an LIRP marriage that will stand the test of time. And if you are an advisor who wants to learn how to do this type of planning in your practice, head over to powerofzero.com. Once again, would love a follow on Twitter. It's at McKnight & Co, at McKnight & Co, or Instagram, David C. McKnight. And again, if you want any of my books in bulk, you can go over to davidmcknightbooks.com. Thank you, folks, for being with me this week. We will look forward to chatting with you same time next week.